and I thank you all very, very much for coming. And if you can't hear or see, let me know. And my plan is just to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, give you some sense of what this book is about, since most people haven't had a chance to read it yet, and then have a discussion, questions and answers, and a couple announcements of things that are happening locally. And this is my first book, and this is a book that I wrote taking a month off from activism in politics, and I sort of sat down and thought about whether there was anything that wasn't really working ideally perfectly in our government in Washington. So it's not thin. And on top of that, I thought about, well, what could we imagine? Not just undoing specific recent damage, but how could we imagine making things better? Making a government that actually represents us and represents things that we haven't even really dared to think we could create yet. And how can we better organize as activists to make it happen? So that's the bulk of the book. You know, I'd say less than half of the book is what's wrong, and the majority is what the heck should we think and do about it. But I can't go through the whole list of what's wrong or the list of things to make better. But if you want to have a discussion, we can talk about almost anything, and it's probably in the book. Or we should talk about why it isn't. And so I thought, you know, I'm going on a tour now of about 50 cities. There's probably about that many chapters. I don't know if they all make good discussion topics, but I thought that in Charlottesville I would talk about chapter 2 just a little bit, because it's about the power of war. For a couple of reasons. One, because I've worked with the Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice here, which has worked against wars, and helped at least to expose what's been wrong with the Iraq War, to prevent thus far an Iran War, to turn, to at least make people aware and turn opinions and voters against wars, although we have a long ways to go. And because I was walking into the gym in Charlottesville the other day, and someone told me he liked my Arrest Bush shirt, and then he told me he works on something related to the War Powers Act. I don't know. Does that describe anybody here? Yeah, and he also told me he was coming. So, but I thought I would talk about this chapter because I have the War Powers Act on my mind. So I'm not going to read you the chapter, but just a little bit. And for context, I would just throw out there, I looked today, the people just of Charlottesville thus far on Iraq and Afghanistan have spent $104.8 million, or 29,341 people provided with health care for a year. And that is not counting taking care of the veterans for decades and decades when they come back. That is not counting interest. That is not counting impacts on cost of energy. That is not counting all of the expenses that mean that you really have to double or triple it. So there are other things we could do other than war with the same money, without all of the other costs as well. So we ought to be paying at least a little attention to who has the power to make war, and how they got it, and how we take it the hell away from them. So since 1973, as many of you may know, presidents who have launched wars without Congress declaring war have done so also in violation of a law called the War Powers Act, which was written in response to Richard Nixon and passed over his veto, which says that for a president to send military forces abroad, not that we don't have them in most countries permanently, but to send military forces into action abroad, unless we are actually under attack, the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours, and they cannot be kept in action for more than 60 days without authorization by Congress. So this is actually weaker than the Constitution, where the president can't do anything without Congress. Congress has to start a war. Congress has to raise the army. We weren't supposed to have a standing army. But it's a law, and it's a law that was violated in going into Iraq as well as Afghanistan. So one way in which Bush really sort of pushed the limits of this was that he got Congress to pass a pretty vague authorization. Go use force pretty much anywhere, anytime, but you have to give us a report on where and why and how it's related to 9/11 and what the dangers are and the threats and so forth. And so that's sort of the first way in which the Iraq War is illegal. No declaration of war, which has been the case since World War II with a lot of wars. The second reason is that the explanations that Bush gave to Congress in his report about weapons of mass destruction and ties to 9/11 and so forth were lies. So even on this resolution that Congress did pass, Bush didn't actually comply with it. In addition, by lying to Congress and by lying to the public, felonies were committed. It is a felony to mislead the Congress. It is a felony to make false statements to Congress. So there's at least a third way in which we launched this war illegally. Bush also tried to get a resolution from the United Nations to make this war legal internationally. The biggest day of protest in world history. Raise your hand if you were there, anywhere where there was a major protest on February 15th, 2003, and if you were in New York City. I know some of us were. This was instrumental in getting the United Nations to say no. They did not legalize it through the United Nations. So that's 4. Fifth, there are international treaties to which we are party that say you cannot go into another nation for the purpose of controlling its resources, which was one of the reasons why we went into Iraq. Sixth, as with any war of aggression, all sorts of lesser war crimes, targeting civilians, journalists, hospitals, ambulances, using anti-personnel weapons, cluster bombs in dense areas, using white phosphorus as a weapon, using depleted uranium weapons, using a new sort of napalm in Mark 77 firebombs, collective punishment of Iraqi civilian populations, all of these war crimes. Seventh, all of the crimes and abuses that have been justified by the fact that it's wartime and have been part of it. All the waste and the fraud, all the secrecy, all the selective leaking of secrets, all the punishment of whistleblowers, the outing of an undercover agent, the obstruction of investigations, the lawless establishment of mercenary operations, the detentions without charge, the torture, rendition, murder, warrantless spying, posse comitatus violations. All of this, I'd say, is a seventh way in which what we're talking about is illegal in this war that we've been opposing so long. And eighth, and finally, not that you couldn't go on, I would say that a treaty made between Bush and Maliki authorizing 3 years of war is of dubious legality as a treaty, but is a treaty that was never ratified by the United States Senate and was passed by the Iraqi Parliament on condition the Iraqi people would get to vote by July of 2009, and it's September. So we are now a nation that regularly bombs civilians, detains the innocent, tortures suspects, sometimes to death. Opinions of the United States around the world have sunk to the point where polls show us to be the most feared rogue state. And this began with Afghanistan, not Iraq, where we have killed and destroyed in great measure, but done very little to either apprehend the criminals we were supposedly there to find, or to benefit the innocent people whose country we have made a more dangerous, more impoverished place to live. The wars that we are fighting are not wars of defense, or even wars between two militaries in any sense. They are wars of a powerful military against guerrilla resistance. No one wins these wars any more than you can win a hurricane. They are unmitigated disasters, and our own intelligence services tell us our occupations have become recruiting tools for terrorists. International terrorist incidents increased so much in 2004 that by 2005, our government no longer kept records, or at least published them. Now, the Constitution very clearly puts the president in charge of the military, a fact which found its way into George Bush's brain and exited his mouth in the form of, "I'm the commander guy." But this does not put the president in charge of launching war, or in charge of rules for prisoners of war, or in charge of funding and creating the military, or making rules to govern and regulate the military, because the Constitution gives all of these powers, and most other powers, to Congress. along with the power to raise and support armies for wars. The Constitution bans the appropriation of any money for that purpose for longer than 2 years, which means that during a lengthy war, Congress has to decide at least every 2 years whether to keep fighting it, and therefore the commander guy does not have the power to begin or end wars, but only the power to serve as the commander of the military, determining how a war is fought while it is fought. This war, any war by the United States is illegal if not declared by Congress or if Congress has declared it over. And this was the clear intention of the authors of the Constitution. Now, unconstitutional wars have become the norm by now, with Democrats having launched at least as many as Republicans. Nonetheless, George Bush managed in this area, as in many, to outdo his predecessors. For one thing, he repeatedly declared in signing statements that Congress cannot in any way regulate the military. Never mind that the Constitution says precisely the opposite. This power is also being stripped away by the increased use of mercenaries, not properly regulated by Congress. Now, 3 proposals have been floated recently, that I know of, related to the War Powers Act. One of them awful, the other 2 I think commendable. The first, the awful one, comes from a bipartisan commission of elder statesmen including Ed Meese, Warren Christopher, James Baker, Lee Hamilton. The proposal that they put out in July 2008 was, predictably enough, to repeal the War Powers Act and replace it with an act requiring that the president, quote, consult with Congress prior to launching a war. This role of consultant is exactly the role current congressional leaders want, a role once played with more grace by court jesters. But it is a recipe for legislating in place the aggrandizement of the executive that James Madison and others were very, very worried about. The second proposal seeks instead to improve things, and this comes from a local here who I usually disagree with, a guy named Larry Sabato, who in 2007 put out a book called A More Perfect Constitution, where he recommends an amendment to the Constitution that would add to the War Powers Act the requirement that congressional authorizations of war include time limits, and after which Congress has to vote each time it runs out to extend the war. Now, while I agree that time limits would be good, I think, and that a constitutional amendment would be ideal, I think we should start with legislation to do that exact same thing, and I would add that those limits should not be more than 12 months. The third proposal comes from a white paper published by the Center for Constitutional Rights in April of this year, which said, because it is so difficult to end wars once begun, which we have seen as public opinion has gone 180 degrees, but the war keeps going. Because it's so difficult to end them once begun, they propose eliminating the permission that the War Powers Act currently and unconstitutionally grants for a president to wage war for 60 to 90 days without congressional approval, arguing that the only exception should be for short-term use of force to repel, which is not to retaliate for, but to repel sudden attacks on U.S. territories, troops, or citizens. Now, I would strip out the language troops and citizens, which looks to me like an easy way to gin up an excuse for a war. I would leave it with territories. CCR also proposes adding an adequate enforcement mechanism to deal with occasions on which presidents violate the law. A new law would prohibit the use of funds for actions violating the law, allow for judicial oversight in cases of conflict between the Congress and the President, and explicitly make a violation of this law an impeachable offense. And then, of course, when Congress does authorize military action, it still has to be in accordance with the UN Charter and international law, and it must not be treated as the supposed authorization to engage in abuses of power and violations of rights. We also need a reform, I think, that I would call the Cheney Halliburton Act. And this would make war profiteering by any war maker a major felony. This would apply to employees of the federal government and anyone who within the past decade has been an employee of the federal government, in particular the president and the vice president. And I'm very much in favor of another reform that might truly prevent aggressive wars, that some people may object to, and we'll talk about it. When soldiers are sent into wars, they and their friends and family do not play any significant role in the war-making decisions. Yet their lives are put at risk on the basis of claims made by people themselves taking no risk at all. Claims of a sort that have through the course of history proven almost universally false. The United States is not supposed to have a lower class that suffers and dies and an upper class that decides when others should suffer and die. There is a simple way around this. We should require that in any war, the military-aged children and grandchildren of the President, the Vice President, all cabinet officials, and all Congress members serve on the front lines in the riskiest positions.
Right on.
Oh, how cruel and awful, right? But how much more cruel and awful to send other people's children to those places.
That's right.
War is our biggest business. It is our grandest undertaking. It is the bulk of our public expenditure. Why should our government itself not be involved? An updated United States Constitution, I would suggest. And in the book, I propose all sorts of endeavors in each direction that I think we should go, including this one, and many steps short of amending the Constitution. But to have a vision, ideally, out there, an updated U.S. Constitution, I think, in this regard, would say that no more than 25% of discretionary U.S. government spending in any given year can be devoted to military expenses of any sort, including wars, including debt and interest payments for past military expenses in wars, and including care for veterans. Second, all military veterans must be provided with free, comprehensive health care and education. Third, the United States is forbidden to maintain a military presence in a foreign nation, to engage in any war of aggression, to employ mercenaries, or to make use of military force on American soil except when actually engaged in a defensive war against a foreign nation. Fourth, the executive cannot begin a war without authorization and funding from Congress, and Congress cannot provide those for longer than 1 year at a time. Fifth, a congressional vote to end a war is not subject to a presidential veto. Sixth, during war, the children and grandchildren of the President, Vice President, all cabinet officers, and every member of Congress who are of military age must serve in the most dangerous combat positions. Sixth, is that six? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Seventh, a president, vice president, or member of Congress who profits financially from any war and is convicted of doing so in a court of law shall be imprisoned for a minimum of 10 years, and there shall be no statute of limitations on the crime.